Imagine you're standing mere feet away from a murderer on the run, blood still visible on his face, and the next morning authorities are searching for him. Do you speak up? Or picture yourself accidentally overhearing criminals celebrating the lives they're destroying while they tip you hundreds of dollars for your silence? Do you walk away? Or what if you witness something bizarre and threatening on a crowded subway platform but convincing anyone feels impossible? Do you even try? Tonight on The Dark Hour, we're exploring something that haunts us more deeply than any ghost or monster ever could. The weight of our own silence. The moment when we choose not to speak, not to act, not to intervene, and that choice echoes through the rest of our lives. These aren't stories about victims who couldn't escape. These are stories about witnesses who chose not to report, about people who saw evil and said nothing, about the psychology of complicity and the unbearable weight of regret. We're going to examine 3 encounters where silence wasn't just a choice. It was a moral failing that the storytellers still carry with them years later. This is The Dark Hour, and tonight we're asking the question that keeps these people awake at night. Why didn't we speak up when it mattered most? Part 1, The Campground Encounter. Let's begin with a story that demonstrates how youthful rebellion and fear of consequences can lead to a silence that enables violence. This happened many years ago to 2 teenage boys we'll call Marcus and Charles, though neither of them were children when it came to understanding right from wrong. Marcus had never liked camping. He describes himself as simply not built for it, not suited for the dirt, the bugs, the uncomfortable nights in sleeping bags that somehow always feel like rocks by morning. Unfortunately, camping wasn't optional in his family. His father was one of those rugged, wilderness-loving types who dragged Marcus into the woods every summer to disconnect from technology and reconnect with nature. By sophomore year of high school, Marcus had finally convinced his father to let him bring a friend to make the experience more bearable. That friend was Charles, a hardcore former Boy Scout who actually loved camping, but was cool about Marcus's hatred for it. Charles was stoked to come partly because he loved camping, but mostly because back then he looked for any excuse to get away from his parents. What neither of them expected was that this camping trip would put them in proximity to a killer and force them to make a choice they would regret for the rest of their lives. The trip didn't go as planned from the start. One of Marcus's father's friends had messed up the campsite booking. Instead of some remote, peaceful spot deep in the woods, they ended up at an overdeveloped campsite with indoor bathrooms, paved walkways, and even a playground for little kids. It wasn't camping, it was glorified backyard living. To say the fathers were upset would be an understatement. But the worst part came a few hours later when they discovered that right next to the campsite was a mini amusement park. An actual amusement park with carnival games, a Ferris wheel, and roller coasters. Those 2 settings were never supposed to collide. Everyone was upset about the situation, but they had driven hours to get there and couldn't just turn around and leave. So they made the best of it. The adults sulked and then got to work setting up camp. Charles, being the experienced Boy Scout, stepped up and within minutes had their tent up perfectly with all the knots tied correctly, the rainfly secure, everything staked and taut like it came out of a manual. Even Marcus's father, who never gave compliments unless someone was bleeding or unconscious, nodded in approval. That night, Marcus and Charles were sharing a tent, and once everything was set up and dinner was done, they slipped away under the excuse of organizing their belongings. The truth was Charles had brought a small metal pipe and some marijuana in an old Altoids tin. Nothing crazy, just enough to take the edge off. Marcus should mention that he and Charles were in that delinquent phase of teenage life where they liked causing trouble and hanging around places they didn't belong. Marcus doesn't smoke marijuana anymore, and part of him will always wonder if the only reason he ever did was because he was trying to stand out and defy the norm. The 2 of them snuck into the woods and smoked, chuckling to themselves the entire time. Neither of them were worried about the smell since they'd probably be avoiding the adults for the rest of the night anyway. After finishing their session, they made their way back to the tent. After a few hours of chilling and talking about friends from school, They both agreed they had way too much energy to sleep. Charles had a very mischievous grin on his face and suggested they go explore the campsite. Marcus was skeptical until he realized Charles meant explore the amusement park, which instantly piqued his interest. Charles said it would probably be easy getting to the top of one of those roller coasters. Climbing stuff was something they loved doing back then, and the thought of climbing a roller coaster was exhilarating. So after they were sure everyone was asleep, they made their move. It was really late by then, well after midnight. They grabbed flashlights and headed to the fence surrounding the park. It wasn't even hard to climb, just a little boost from Charles and they were in. Let's pause here and examine what's happening from a psychological perspective. These two teenagers were engaging in multiple illegal activities: trespassing, potentially drug use depending on the jurisdiction, and breaking and entering into a closed amusement park. They were already in a mindset of rule-breaking and avoiding authority. This is crucial to understanding why they made the choices they did later. When you're already operating outside the law, when you're already hiding things from adults, when you're already in that defensive posture against authority, it becomes exponentially harder to suddenly switch gears and become a cooperative witness. The place was dark, but there were security guards patrolling, and every so often they'd hear the hum of a golf cart making its rounds. It felt like they were in some kind of stealth video game, sneaking around and trying not to get caught. They progressed through the park slowly, ducking behind buildings and keeping an eye on the patrol. At one point, they had to sprint across an open stretch of road to avoid a guard. It was actually really thrilling but also scary. Everything seemed like a game, but both of them knew the consequences would be harsh if they were caught. They finally made it to the base of the roller coaster, and from up close it looked way bigger than it had from the campsite. They spotted maintenance stairs running up alongside the main ascent and didn't hesitate. The metal rungs clanged softly under their feet as they climbed one step at a time, trying not to make too much noise. There were no railings for part of the stretch, which was actually kind of terrifying. They finally reached the top, and the view was unreal. They could see the entire park below them. They took a single photo up there. Marcus wishes they had taken more pictures, but they were being extremely cautious not to draw attention to themselves, as they wouldn't be able to get away in time if someone spotted them from below. Eventually, they figured they'd pushed their luck long enough and decided to head back. After making it to the bottom, they started creeping through the park back the way they had come. For whatever reason, the return route was much quicker than the initial one. Maybe the patrol wasn't as intense at that hour. They were maybe 5 minutes from the spot where they'd hopped the fence when they had to stop. One of the guards was making a round in a golf cart, so they had to quickly duck behind a snack shack and wait for them to pass. That's when Marcus noticed something move in the dark. At first he thought maybe he imagined it, or maybe it was a shadow from the golf cart's headlights bouncing off something weird. But then Charles tapped his arm and pointed in the same direction. Marcus focused his gaze and confirmed it. About 30 feet away, just barely visible in the darkness between two buildings, was another person. They were crouching down just like Marcus and Charles, like they were all sneaking around and trying to avoid the guards. It didn't look like a kid, though. The worst part about it was that Marcus was fairly confident this person was looking directly at them. At this point, both teenagers were actually scared. Between the patrolling guards and now this unknown figure, the situation was getting overwhelming. As much as they wanted to move, they still couldn't because the guards still hadn't passed yet. Marcus kept his eyes glued to the figure, and they actually started moving. They darted across a patch of open ground and right through the little spill of light coming from a nearby street lamp. For a split second, Marcus saw him clearly. It was a man like he suspected. He was wearing tattered clothing and had this really awkward stride like he was injured or disfigured. But none of that was as unsettling as the dark liquid smeared across his face. It looked like blood. Charles saw it too, and the two of them exchanged a really terrified look. Eventually, the man ducked out of sight. The guard finally passed them and they kept moving. Let's stop here and understand what Marcus and Charles were actually seeing, because this detail is crucial. This wasn't someone in costume. This wasn't another teenager playing around. This was an adult man with what appeared to be blood on his face, moving through a closed amusement park in the middle of the night, clearly trying to avoid security, exhibiting behavior that suggested injury or violence. Every instinct these teenagers had should have been screaming that something was seriously wrong. But they were trapped in their own illegal activity, in their own fear of consequences, and that fear would override their civic duty. They didn't say a word as they made their way back to the fence. Marcus kept checking over his shoulder every few seconds, convinced they were being followed, but no one was there. They made it back to the fence, scaled it the same way they came in, and dropped down on the other side. The difference was this time they didn't laugh about it. All Marcus wanted was to be back in the safe confines of their tent. He could tell Charles was thinking the same thing. By the time they made it back to their tent, neither of them brought up sleeping. They just lay there in their sleeping bags trying to make sense of what they'd seen. The best they could come up with was that it was some homeless person doing who knows what. A stupid explanation, Marcus knows, but they couldn't think of anything else. This is a classic example of rationalization, of the human mind trying to create a comfortable narrative that doesn't require action or involvement. It's much easier to tell yourself, it's probably nothing, than to admit you witnessed something that demands a response. The next morning started off normally. They got up, had something to eat, and started packing gear to go fishing. But around 10 in the morning, one of the camp staffers came around to their tent site with an announcement that the whole campsite was supposed to hear. Apparently, a man had been stabbed and killed the night before at a lake about 4 miles away from the campground. They weren't giving many details, but the person who did it was still on the loose, and the local sheriff's office had asked all park rangers and campsite staff within a certain mile radius to be on high alert. They described the suspect as a disheveled white male in his late 30s, shirtless, possibly bleeding, or with blood on his clothes. Then they instructed everyone to pack their things and leave for their own safety. Marcus and Charles instantly connected the dots. It must have been that man they had seen the night before in the amusement park. And here's where the story takes its darkest turn. They kept their mouths shut. They didn't tell Marcus's father. They didn't tell the Rangers. And Marcus still doesn't really know why. Marcus knows he's going to get hate for this, and he accepts that. But at that age, he was more concerned with staying out of trouble than anything else. He still kicks himself for not speaking up. His statement could have led to the capture of a dangerous person who may have gone on to commit more crimes. Marcus is still close with Charles today. They went to the same college, graduated together, and work in similar fields. This experience is something they don't often talk about, though. If Marcus is being honest, he thinks Charles feels much more guilty about not speaking up than he does. But let's analyze what actually happened here from a psychological perspective, because this is where the story reveals something profound about human nature and moral failure. Marcus and Charles witnessed something extraordinary. They saw a man with blood on his face hiding in an amusement park in the middle of the night. Less than 12 hours later, they learned that a murder had occurred within miles of their location, and the description matched exactly what they had seen. The evidence chain was clear, the civic duty was obvious, and yet they chose silence. Why? Marcus says it was fear of getting in trouble, fear of having to admit to their own illegal activities, fear of parental consequences. But there's something deeper here. There's the psychology of what researchers call the bystander effect, the diffusion of responsibility. Marcus and Charles could tell themselves that someone else would probably come forward, that the Rangers probably had other leads, that their information probably wasn't that important anyway. These are the lies we tell ourselves to justify inaction. There's also the temporal disconnect. When they saw the man, they didn't know he was a murderer. In that moment, he was just a strange figure in the darkness. By the time they learned what he actually was, the moment of direct witnessing had passed. It became easier to rationalize silence because they hadn't witnessed the crime itself, only the aftermath. But this is exactly the kind of information law enforcement desperately needs. Witnesses who can place suspects in specific locations at specific times. Witnesses who can provide descriptions and behavioral details. Marcus and Charles had all of this information and chose to withhold it. The consequences of their silence are unknowable. Did this man commit additional crimes? Did he hurt other people? Did he evade capture for longer because Marcus and Charles didn't provide their witness testimony? These are questions that Marcus says haunt him, though he admits Charles feels the guilt more acutely. And this raises an important point about regret and moral development. Some people carry the weight of their inaction more heavily than others. Some people are able to rationalize and move forward, while others are crushed by the knowledge of what they should have done. Marcus and his friend were teenagers, yes, but they were old enough to understand right from wrong. They were old enough to know that you report dangerous criminals to authorities. They made a choice, and that choice was wrong, and they have to live with that choice for the rest of their lives. The question we need to ask is, why do people make these choices? What psychological mechanisms allow us to witness something important and choose silence? And how do we build a society where people feel empowered and obligated to speak up even when it's uncomfortable? Part 2, the killer clown. Now we need to examine a different kind of silence, one that comes not from guilt or fear of personal consequences, but from the futility of reporting something that seems impossible to prove or investigate. This is about a teenager we'll call Sarah, who encountered something during the 2016 clown hysteria that changed how she thinks about believability and witness credibility. This happened back in October of 2016, right when that weird clown hysteria was all over the news. People were posting creepy clown sightings across the country. Most of them were obviously hoaxes or people just trying to get attention. But as we all know, there were a couple of true cases that were downright terrifying. What happened to Sarah was one of them. Sarah was 16, a junior in high school. She had just finished 7th period, and after saying goodbye to all her friends, hopped on the number 6 train heading uptown. The train was mostly empty, which was kind of unusual but not unheard of. Sarah wasn't being very attentive to her surroundings. She had her headphones in and was blasting music, probably Drake, she thinks. To make matters worse, she was reviewing chemistry flashcards on her phone, so she was about as unaware as humanly possible. Never a good idea when traveling alone, but she knew the area well enough to think she'd probably be fine. She was planning to get off at 96th Street and walk home from there. Nothing unusual, just a regular Wednesday. But things went downhill really fast. They arrived at 96th, and Sarah jumped out of her seat instinctively, barely even looking up to make sure it was the right station. That train ride was something she had done so many times that the routine had become second nature. Getting on and off was like a reflex. With her head still buried in her phone and her music still blasting in her ears, Sarah made her way over to the doors. But as soon as they slid open, she realized out of the edge of her vision that something was obstructing her path. She looked up and realized some person had stepped directly into the doorway. Only it wasn't a normal person. It was a clown. Let's pause here because this moment is critical to understanding why Sarah's story matters, and why her subsequent silence tells us something important about reporting unusual crimes. Sarah was completely unprepared for what she saw. She was in her routine, her autopilot mode, doing something she'd done hundreds of times before. And suddenly, that routine was shattered by something that shouldn't exist in that context. A person in full clown costume blocking a subway door. The clown was wearing the full outfit: oversized rainbow pants, a baggy yellow shirt with red suspenders, giant red shoes, and exaggerated white makeup smeared across his face. Red nose, blue eyebrows, the whole cartoon nightmare. The only thing missing was the wig. Sarah was literally frozen in shock at the sight of him. Not only was she caught completely off guard, but until then she had never been in such close proximity to something so bizarre. The clown didn't say anything. He just stood there, not trying to get on the train, but clearly preventing Sarah from getting off. Sarah snapped out of her haze and realized she had maybe 5 seconds before the doors would close, so she had to do something. She tried to brush past him, but the literal moment she made contact with him, he leaned down in one fluid motion like he was trying to make sure they were face to face. Before he could grab or restrain her, Sarah sprinted past him, and that's when he lurched forward in an attempt to tackle her. Sarah dodged him and continued running, and he started chasing her. It was terrifying. There was no one else around, and Sarah was being chased by a killer clown. The 96th Street station is relatively quiet in the early afternoon, so she was essentially on her own. Sarah shot a glance behind her and saw him pursuing her. Only his stride wasn't normal. He was running with this jerky motion like his limbs were disproportionate, but Sarah was much more focused on what was now in his hand. It was what looked like a kitchen knife. Sarah didn't know where he had been hiding it or what his intentions were, but she didn't care. She ran up the stairs and out of the station and immediately reported the situation to the police. The clown didn't follow Sarah onto the street, but she was still pretty shaken up. The police sent someone down to the station, but he was gone by then. Even after talking to the police and being reassured that she was safe, Sarah couldn't get the irrational thought out of her head that he somehow knew where she lived and was going to track her down later. But that obviously didn't happen. In fact, nothing else ever happened at all. Sarah wouldn't be surprised if her story ended up on the news as one of the many strange clown encounters of 2016, although she can't say for sure. It took her a few weeks to fully get over this experience. Now let's analyze what Sarah did right and what the limitations of her actions reveal about the psychology of reporting bizarre crimes. Sarah did everything she was supposed to do. She escaped the immediate danger. She reported to police immediately. She gave a statement. She cooperated fully. And yet the outcome was essentially nothing. The clown was gone by the time police arrived. There were apparently no witnesses. There was no security camera footage that captured the encounter. Sarah's testimony alone wasn't enough to launch any kind of meaningful investigation. This is the frustration of reporting crimes that seem impossible or that occur in contexts where evidence is hard to gather. Sarah encountered someone who was clearly dangerous, who had a weapon, who attempted to physically assault her. But because the attacker vanished and left no trace, Sarah's experience becomes just another data point in a wave of clown sightings that authorities largely dismissed as mass hysteria. Here's what makes Sarah's story particularly important to this discussion of silence and speaking up. Sarah didn't choose silence. She reported immediately and completely. But the lack of results, the sense that her report disappeared into a bureaucratic void, teaches witnesses a powerful lesson. Sometimes speaking up doesn't matter. Sometimes the system can't or won't act on your testimony. Sometimes the bizarre nature of what you witnessed makes it feel like you're just contributing to noise, rather than solving a crime. This is why we see so much silence around unusual crimes. When people witness something that seems impossible or that exists outside normal crime patterns, they start to doubt whether reporting will accomplish anything. They imagine police dismissing them. They imagine being labeled as attention-seeking or delusional. They imagine contributing to mass hysteria. And so they stay silent, and those silences allow predators to operate. The 2016 clown hysteria is a perfect example of this dynamic. Most sightings were hoaxes, yes, but buried within that noise were real assaults, real threats, real dangerous individuals using the cultural moment as cover for predatory behavior. Sarah's encounter was one of those real incidents. She was actually chased by someone with a knife. But because it happened during a period when everyone was seeing clowns everywhere, her legitimate trauma gets lumped in with hoaxes and pranks. The lesson here isn't that Sarah should have done anything differently. She did exactly what she should have done. The lesson is that we as a society need to create better systems for processing and investigating reports that seem bizarre or that occur during periods of mass hysteria. We need to take witnesses seriously, even when their accounts seem to fit cultural narratives. We need to recognize that predators specifically choose moments of confusion and disbelief to operate because They know their crimes will be dismissed. Sarah's story also reveals something about the lasting psychological impact of not being believed or not seeing results from reporting. Even though Sarah did the right thing, even though she reported immediately, the lack of resolution leaves her with ongoing anxiety. She spent weeks convinced the clown knew where she lived. She couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. And while reporting to police provided some relief, the knowledge that he was never caught, that he could still be out there, that creates a different kind of trauma. This is what silence looks like even when you speak up. Sometimes speaking up feels like shouting into the void. Sometimes doing everything right still results in nothing. And that teaches witnesses across society that maybe it's not worth the effort. Maybe it's not worth reliving the trauma of testimony if nothing will come of it anyway. This is a dangerous lesson, and it's one we need to counteract by treating every report seriously and following through on investigations, even when circumstances make them difficult. Part 3: The Pool House. Now we need to examine the most complex form of silence, the kind that develops gradually as someone becomes entangled in criminal enterprise, where speaking up would mean admitting their own complicity, where the decision to finally walk away comes only after months of participation. This is about a young man we'll call David who took a job that seemed too good to be true and learned exactly why it paid so well. This isn't a typical scary story, but it's worth examining because it demonstrates how ordinary people become involved in extraordinary crimes through a series of small compromises, how silence becomes normalized, and how difficult it becomes to extricate yourself once you've crossed certain lines. David was 2 years out of undergrad when the whole thing started. While he was technically getting an online graduate certificate at the same school where he obtained his bachelor's degree, he still had a ton of free time on his hands. During that period of his life, David was jumping around from odd job to odd job, looking for any gig to fill the hours and help him stack some cash. Indeed was his best friend at the time. He found 90% of his leads from that one website alone. He was getting tired of food delivery around the same 6 neighborhoods for minimum wage, so he decided a change of pace was in order. As he was browsing Indeed one night, David stumbled upon something intriguing. It was a private lifeguarding job at a hotel a few towns over. That doesn't sound abnormal by itself, but there were a couple strange details in the listing that gave him pause. First of all, the hours were backward. They weren't normal pool hours. You'd expect a typical hotel pool to open sometime in the morning and close sometime in the evening, with maybe a few hours of downtime in the middle of the day. Well, this was the opposite. Nearly exactly. They wanted someone to operate and supervise a swimming pool from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. during the week. It was basically a night shift for a pool. That wasn't the strangest thing, though. The requirements explicitly requested an individual who didn't speak Spanish. Let's repeat that. They specifically wanted someone who didn't speak Spanish. Here was the problem for David. He'd been speaking Spanish since he was a little kid. He's literally half Mexican. The town the hotel was based in was predominantly populated by Spanish-speaking Americans too, so that requirement didn't make much sense. In fact, nothing about the listing made sense to David. He remembers being beyond perplexed when combing through it. There was one thing he was feeling pretty good about, though: $30 an hour, which would probably be something like $50 in today's inflation-adjusted economy. David doesn't really know if that's true, but the point is $30 an hour back then was extraordinary money. Safe to say, he disregarded all the other nonsense and decided to focus on the compensation. He decided he would just pretend not to know Spanish. What were they going to do? The position must have been either brand new or in really low demand because David heard back and was actually invited to interview within a few hours. Let's pause here because David's decision to lie about his language abilities is the first compromise, the first step into a situation he didn't fully understand. He knew something was off about the job. He knew the requirements were strange, but the money was so good that he talked himself into ignoring the red flags. This is how people end up involved in criminal enterprises, not through dramatic recruitment or coercion, but through a series of small compromises motivated by financial need or greed. Fast forward to the first day. David pulled up to the hotel and everything looked exactly how you'd expect. A pudgy Mexican-looking guy came out to greet him, and the two of them exchanged information and had a laugh. He was actually really friendly and pretty funny too, and his amiable demeanor put David at ease a little. But as they were walking into the complex, another taller guy turned a corner and started staring David down. David could tell right away that he was being profiled, and he started wondering whether having the first person behave so friendly was a ploy to get him to lower his guard. The second guy, the taller one, walked right up to David and started communicating with him in Spanish. He didn't smile, didn't say hello, didn't shake hands, nothing. David instantly knew what he was doing. He was trying to gauge whether David knew Spanish so the listing hadn't been nonsense. David gave him a blank stare even though he understood every word. The man wasn't saying anything crazy, he was just rambling about the weather. It wasn't important enough to remember. After a few seconds, David turned to the first guy who turned to the taller guy, and then the two of them burst out laughing like they had both been in on some practical joke. The taller guy flashed a smile, outstretched his hand, and said he was just messing with David. David went along with it, but he was a little weirded out. The taller guy introduced himself as Heath, and the bigger guy as a Stabbin. The three of them walked through the complex to get to the pool, and Heath, who David assumed was the one in charge, started talking him through the job. According to Heath, they needed someone to work later hours because they wanted to increase revenue, and they were going to start charging non-guests just to use the pool. David didn't even know if that was legal, but he wasn't about to start complaining. David was told they wanted someone who didn't speak Spanish because it would prevent rowdy outsiders from trying to harass him, which David didn't fully understand but went along with anyway. His responsibilities were as follows. Lifeguard, obviously. Collect money from non-guests trying to enter the pool and call Heath if there was any sort of problem. And there was one more thing. Heath told David that if anyone showed him a blue wristband, he was to let them into what Heath called the pool house, which was a huge building behind the lifeguard stand. David didn't ask questions. Here's the second compromise. David was being told to grant access to a building based on showing a wristband. No explanation of what was in the building, no explanation of why the wristband system existed, no explanation of what these people would be doing in there. Any reasonable person would have questions. But David didn't ask them because he was already committed to the lie about not speaking Spanish, already committed to taking this bizarre job, already motivated by the money to not rock the boat. The first week was really chill. The first few weeks actually. A lot more people used the pool than David was expecting, so he had his work cut out for him. He collected money from outsiders and kept an eye on swimmers. No one showed him a wristband. The first time someone did show him a wristband was about a month in. On some random day, this buff Hispanic guy in sunglasses and a white button-down shirt walked up to David, clearly not knowing a lick of English. He showed David his wristband, and David unlocked the pool house. About an hour later, the man emerged and began walking toward the exit gate. The pool house door locked automatically, so David didn't have to interact with him or get down again, but David watched him leave. The man's backpack looked significantly more full than it had when he arrived, but other than that, everything was normal. Over the next few weeks, more and more people started showing David wristbands, and a lot of them started showing up together. More and more non-guests started using the pool too, because David began collecting a lot more money than he ever had. At one point, David realized he was actually collecting too much money, like people entering the pool would overpay him by a crazy amount on a consistent basis. He called Heath about it, and Heath told him not to worry, saying that people made mistakes all the time. David could tell Heath didn't want to talk about it more than he had to because he hung up the phone while David was mid-sentence. Amidst everything fishy that was going on, that short, harmless phone call confirmed to David that he was involved in something more than just lifeguarding a swimming pool. Only after hanging up did the true gravity of the situation hit him. David's mind started filtering all the noise until there was a single thought he couldn't purge from his brain: money laundering. Let's stop and examine David's thought process here, because this is the critical moment where he had to make a choice. He now suspected correctly that he was facilitating money laundering and possibly drug trafficking. He had enough information to go to police. He could have walked away immediately, but he chose neither option. Instead, he rationalized. He told himself he didn't know for sure. He told himself he couldn't confirm his suspicions safely. He told himself he didn't want to forfeit $30 an hour over nothing. So he kept his mouth shut and kept the job. This is the third compromise, and it's the big one. This is the moment when David consciously chose to continue participating in what he believed to be criminal activity, because the financial benefits outweighed his moral concerns. After that moment, though, David started piecing everything together. The pool house, or the building he had been told was a pool house, was clearly where the illegal activity occurred. Illegal gambling, drug trafficking, something worse. Whatever it was happening right behind David every single day, obstructed from view by only a single locked door that David himself was unlocking for people. Patrons of the pool started getting more friendly with David, especially the wristband wearers. Strangers began learning his name, and he went from solely collecting money to collecting tips, high fives, and greetings too. As people got more comfortable with David, they started talking in front of him. He'd catch pieces of their conversations in Spanish, and all his suspicions were confirmed. They were discussing criminal activity openly because they believed David couldn't understand them. This is when David should have realized how deep he was in. He was now a trusted member of this organization. They felt comfortable discussing crimes in his presence. He had become complicit not through dramatic involvement, but through consistent facilitation and silence. The psychology of this gradual involvement is crucial to understanding how ordinary people end up participating in criminal enterprises. Admittedly, the added benefits made overlooking everything else much easier. Plus, David told himself his hands were clean. He was being employed to perform a job which was exactly what he was doing. This is the rationalization of complicity, the belief that as long as you're just doing what you're told, as long as you're not directly committing the crimes yourself, you bear no moral responsibility. This is false. David was facilitating crime. He was an essential component of their operation. Without him, or someone like him, they couldn't run their money laundering scheme. Speaking of the job, David actually had to rescue a drowning child a few days later. It wasn't anything overly heroic, just a kid who strayed too far into the deep end and clearly couldn't swim. But when David returned to the surface with the child, everyone gave him a standing ovation. It was a really unique feeling. After that, Heath actually came down from wherever in the hotel he had been and thanked David personally for doing such a good job lifeguarding. Heath said he owed David his life, which David didn't understand until he realized the kid he saved was actually Heath's son. The next day, Heath, Esteban, and a bunch of other men, some of whom David recognized as wristband wearers, were all waiting at the gate to greet David with a glass of wine. That obviously felt great, but the good feeling didn't last. After everyone toasted David, one of the men made a toast in Spanish. David doesn't remember what was said verbatim, but it was not a pleasant speech. The man was basically toasting all the money they were making and all the lives they were destroying. Everyone laughed and drank. That was the moment that made David realize he had gotten addicted to something seriously insidious. No amount of money and tips should have justified him staying at that hotel that long and yet regrettably he had. This is the moment of true moral clarity, when David finally understood not just that he was involved in something illegal, but that he was involved in something evil. These people were celebrating destroying lives. They were profiting from human suffering. And David had been helping them do it for months. The next day, David's mother called him while he was at the pool. David's mother,